while the monarchy is no longer the unifying force it once was, the Queen, in fact, did manage to be that national glue. And we saw the sort of organic response in over a quarter of a million people queuing to witness her lying in state, which, of course, the security costs around that alone will have contributed to this figure.
Now, the Treasury has said the late Queen's funeral, lying in state, and other events during last year's period of national mourning cost taxpayers £162 million. Government departments across the UK covered the cost of the 11 days of ceremony and security that culminated in the state funeral. Joining me now to put the numbers into context is Dr. Tessa Dunlop, author of Elizabeth and Phillip. Good evening, Tessa.
Hello, how are you, Kate?
Very well, thanks for joining us. 162 million sounds, well, it sounds like an enormous amount, doesn't it? Where does it sit in context, though? Is it reasonable?
Well, I was trying to drill down into what the security brief of the royal family costs the nation each year so that we could have some sort of comparison. But in fact, those figures are fairly opaque. The ones that are banded about are relatively outdated, and it stands at about £100 million a year, which incidentally is considerably more than the sovereign grant. Now, compare 100 million to 162 million, and obviously you think, well, for a week. I mean, it was a little bit longer than a week. It's an extended period of mourning, wasn't it? Which I'm presuming that this includes all those costs, those incurred in Scotland and Wales, etc. as well. But I think we have to differentiate here between a large ceremonial event, one of the largest since the Second World War, the first state funeral we've had since Winston Churchill, and also a global occasion. You'll remember Macron's famous comment, she's your queen, but she's also the queen. And what was extraordinary about the queen by the end of her reign was that actually her appeal was greater than the monarchy's. While the monarchy is no longer the unifying force it once was, the queen, in fact, did manage to be that national glue. And we saw the sort of organic response in over a quarter of a million people queuing to witness her lying in state, which, of course, the security costs around that alone will have contributed to this figure. So I think, actually, I don't expect this cost to incur the ire of even the quarter of the population who apparently now wish Britain was a republic. However, I think that the cumulative impact of large costs, including this one, and then the coronation, and then the security brief, are going to increasingly stick in the craw of a more sceptical population.
Yeah, it does feel the fire, doesn't it, somewhat? The coronation costs are estimated at about 100 million. And if you say, and as you say, security detail could be around another 100 million a year, then you've got the 162 million for a funeral. So, you know, within the last 12 months, you're sort of edging up towards 400 million pounds. I mean, you can't get a refund. It is I mean, you know, for us, up to that point, it had been a once-in-a-lifetime event. But when you look at the funeral of Princess Diana or of other equivalents, Queen Mother, although it wasn't a state funeral, this is so many more times as much, isn't it? It is a huge figure.
It is a huge figure. Of course, security costs have spiraled exponentially. You can look at the breakdown of these costs and which department incurred what. And actually, the Home Office carried the largest sum, far larger, for instance, than the Department of Culture and Media, which you might assume would have incurred more costs, given that this was a giant ceremonial spectacle. But I think for many of us, almost everyone, in fact, there was something about the end of Philip and Elizabeth, their deaths, which in many ways he was the semicolon, she was the full stop. This was about putting to bed not just a woman who'd served for 70 years, but also the end of an era. That idea of the great generation, those who tied us back to the Blitz, to Churchill, a nostalgic idea of Great Britain from the mid-20th century. And I think, again, that's why people aren't focusing on this. What's so ironic is today all the headlines are on the Harry and Meghan car chase. But actually, I think one talks to the other, because you could say, OK, so our Home Office isn't paying for the security of Harry and Meghan. But at the same time, we do pay for the security of numerous fairly minor royals who most people perhaps couldn't even really name or aren't particularly bothered about. And that is an ongoing expense. We do provide 24/7 security for all their giant palaces There is no inheritance tax paid, and that has been highlighted recently in this investigation that's been taken into King Charles and his riches, because of course he hasn't paid inheritance tax on, for instance, Balmoral and Sandringham. And I think it's when you start looking at this slightly murky underbelly of royal financing that people will ask questions. The Queen's funeral, well, she was exceptional. There is no question.
It's really
Even if
hard
you're a
to argue
Republican,
with it, isn't it?
unique.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
There are perhaps more kind of pressing expenses to be looked at. Thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting. Dr. Tessa Dunlop. Cheers, Tessa, author of Elizabeth and Philip.